Well, Andrew Davis, welcome back to the Liminal Living podcast. It's great to have you back on.
Hey, thank you for the invite. Good to be back, Tom.
Well, last time we talked about Whitehead and philosophy and theology and where the church is going and aliens and all this great, huge stuff. I got done with that conversation. I was like, man, I want to do that again. So here we are again. And it's
Awesome.
great. You're like episode 2 of season 4, but there's something even bigger that's happening. You're episode number 100, your official 100th episode.
No kidding. I love
Yes.
that. Well, we
You don't
better
get a
make it a
prize or
good one.
anything, though. You don't get a
Oh,
prize. I'm sorry.
the prize is being on the podcast.
It is. It is going to totally be on the podcast. So last time we talked about your last book, which was Metaphysics of Exo-Life, and I had,
Yeah.
gosh, so much fun nerding out about so many questions that I've wanted to ask somebody. And after that one, I was like, I gotta have him back on the show because now I got even more questions, and it was great. So you got a new
Yeah.
online course coming, and I was like, that's the perfect excuse to get Andrew back on the show. We're going to talk about your online course today. So,
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I'll say that the whole exo theme is one I'm still very much involved in. So I also enjoyed our previous conversation, but
oh,
I'll have new stuff coming out in the new year, hopefully on the exo theme.
all right. Now,
Um,
when you say EXO, what are you talking about? Like,
Well, right. So, exo life. So the previous text I wrote was metaphysics of exo life, which is sort of just a short way of saying extraterrestrial life. So,
yeah,
where we hear different scientists or astronomers talk about exoplanets, right, which really refer to planets outside our solar system. So,
aha,
the exo term or the astro term, if you want, are being thrown around quite a bit. So, it's
yeah.
a really fascinating domain of research, but that's not necessarily our topic for today. But we can go
No, but
wherever.
I could probably talk for 3 hours on that one alone because it's so much fun. I'm a astronomer. Like I'm a
Yeah.
backyard astronomer. I got a telescope. I actually teach astronomy to high school students on Fridays. So,
That's right. I remember you mentioned that. That's fantastic. Well,
yeah.
I was just out in the backyard with my stepdaughter last night with the stargazing app, looking around, finding
Oh
Mars
yeah.
elsewhere. So it's a
Were
lot of
you
fun.
able to catch the Northern Lights any other times this last year that you?
Un- Unfortunately, not. They were here in Santa Rosa, so I'm here in Santa Rosa, California. My brother was on the hill at his place; he could see them, but I was not able to see them from the neighborhood dwelling spot.
Uh,
So one day, I
yeah,
hope.
yeah, it was an experience. We were in our backyard, and we're kind of central Lower Peninsula, Michigan, which the
Okay,
Northern Lights, if they come, they're like Northern Horizon. You got to get your phone out and see them. But
sure,
man,
sure,
they just exploded right over our head. It was like strobing, and it was really,
beautiful. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
it was
really
really
hope
cool.
to see it one day. Certainly.
I hope you get a chance to because it was just life changing. I was like crying. I was like, this is
Hey,
beautiful.
that's an appropriate response to awe and beauty.
Eh, I
Yeah,
agree. I
for sure.
agree. I agree. So, can you tell us a little bit about your online course that you're releasing that's kind of sparking this
Yeah.
conversation?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So maybe I'll contextualize it in this way. So one of the most important, I'd say, philosophical and theological discoveries that I made during my graduate school years, and this was in Claremont a number of years ago, was the discovery of Alfred North Whitehead. And some of your listeners, no doubt, will be familiar with his name, but he, in the modern world, is probably the most famous expression of what's called process philosophy or process theology. And I fell in love with Whitehead's thinking. He's hardly for the faint of heart. Many people will find Whitehead very difficult to read, and I've been reading and wrestling with Whitehead for a number of years. And so I finally given myself the gusto to launch a 5 week online introductory course to his thought. I'm calling it Whitehead's Universe. And so it's fully online. It's catered towards beginners, towards the philosophically and theologically curious, we might say. And the content of the course is a new text that I've been writing over the last few years. It's a new introduction to Whitehead's Universe. I'm almost done with it. I have 4 of 5 parts written. But this book is provided for registered students in both PDF form and also audio form. So I've actually had fun this past winter recording drafts of the text. So students can, if they want, walk and listen as opposed to simply sitting and reading, which is something I do a lot, so I've been trying to do more audiobooks and hiking, listening as I listen, and it's a different experience to do so. So I give the audio in the PDF form, and in addition to that, we provide additional supplemental readings. So there's other readings that we offer. Students can engage in those if they want, and we meet on Zoom over 5 weeks, over a month, to think together about Whitehead's universe. So let me say a little bit about the flow of the course. So Whitehead's wife, her name was Evelyn, or Evelyn, has a wonderful way of describing Whitehead's thinking, and she does it in the form of a prism. The prism is this metaphor, and she says, Whitehead's thinking is a prism. She says if you've seen it from one side, you've not seen it. You have to see it from all sides, from underneath and overhead, as it spins with light and color.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it's a beautiful image because no one knew Whitehead's thinking or who he was more than Evelyn, and his thought really is prismatic. So we sort of begin the course with this metaphor of a prism, and each week is a sort of um, surveying of one face or side of the prism as it spins with light and color. So let me just mention the five faces that we'll be getting into. So week one is more of a historical face of the prism. So we're going to be looking at themes of being and becoming. We're going to try to contextualize process philosophy historically, because Whitehead was the preeminent expression of its modern form, but of course there's an ancient history to process style thinking that I think we don't want to lose. So the first phase of the prism is this historical phase. The second is more of a philosophical phase, so it's called experience everywhere. So we're going to think with Whitehead about what he terms his philosophy of organism and how it relates to our experience. It's going to be a little bit nerdy, but a lot of fun. The third side or face of the prism, I call the cosmological side. We're going to think about possibility, novelty, and value, the place of these notions in cosmological and biological evolution, and the meaning behind it all. And then finally, or not quite finally, but the fourth phase is the theological side. So it's titled God as Poet of the World. And we're going to think about how Whitehead thinks about God's philosophical function for the world process, and the beautiful statements he makes about thinking about God and how we need to rethink our understanding of God's involvement in a truly evolutionary universe. And the last side of the prism, as we move around it, is the civilizational side, we might call it. And this is the side of the book that I still need to write in the new year. And it's called The New Reformation. And that's a title Whitehead gives to a chapter in his book, Adventures of Ideas. And so we'll think a little bit about his critiques of the philosophical and religious tradition. We'll think about the relationship between science and religion, as well as how his thinking, at least I would argue, can stimulate some really positive spiritual or existential transitions. So it's going to be an adventurous course, and it's an open rolling schedule. So the January, February iteration is being launched in about a little over a week. So students can still register there, but the March, April iteration will open up in early February. And so all the information about the course is at whiteheadsuniverse.com, and you can download the syllabus there. And yeah, would love to discuss it more and have anyone involved who's interested in Whitehead and wanting to get a better grip on his thinking, certainly. So this would be a good place to start.
I would add anybody who's having a hard time contextualizing God in
Great.
the world that we have really just exploded into over the past 100 years
Yeah.
would probably benefit from this course too. Not just people curious about Whitehead, but people who just look at our world as it is and then
Yeah.
like, why does God not make sense in this new world? Because
Mm-hmm.
we have like this Thomas Aquinas, like from the what, 1500s, like
Mm.
he thought some really new thoughts about God, but then it's like we stopped there, and it's like, okay,
Mm.
he figured everything out, we're good to go. But then over the last 100 years, like our cosmology, our science, our everything has just exploded, and that medieval God doesn't fit into the new package very well. And so a lot of people
So,
just don't know really how to make
sure.
sense of God in this new world. So,
So I think that's such a good point, Tom, because Aquinas was drawing upon Aristotelian philosophy, right? And this is a larger point about sort of philosophy and theology. They always have been dancing this dynamic tango. So Aquinas draws on Aristotle's metaphysics, his philosophy, in order to express um, theological conviction, Christian faith for his context. But our context has changed, and it's always been an open question as to which philosophy is best going to suit theological efforts. So at
Hmm.
least process thinkers, process theologians are drawing on Whitehead in a way that Aquinas was kind of drawing on Aristotle. We're saying that here is a philosophical scheme of ideas that is adequate to the best knowledge that we have at hand. And that actually allows us to rethink the reality of God in ways that are truly beautiful and profound. So it's a good point. History is on the move, and this is a fundamental conviction, certainly for process thinking. It was for Whitehead, no doubt.
Yeah. Yeah. We have that whole, um, I mean, just the amount of progress we have made in our understanding of science and the world and everything.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
just really, it seems like we had two responses to like this ever changing world, and that's either to double down on
mm,
previous things and then create pseudo categories of pseudo science, pseudo history, pseudo whatever that
mm,
still fit nicely into our religious boxes, or the abandonment of it altogether and just say, yeah, that was for the old world. The new world's coming. But,
right,
if you really think about science is really based in the experience because we experience something and then we draw the science out of it. And I was listening to
yeah,
Adam Frank today, and he says, and then we forget about the experience, and then we codify the science as like this, canonized thing that can't be touched, and we forget that we are experiencers of the world, and we have to
right.
start from that place. And yeah, I think Andrew Whitehead has some things to say about that foundational place that I'm really curious about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, certainly experience is primary. You have no science without it. You have no philosophy without it. I mean,
Hmm.
so I think central to Whitehead's thinking, to process thinking, is a recovery of the profundity of our experience as an expression of this universe. We have actually no other place to start. And we have to start there and carefully extend imaginatively our thinking about what the rest of the world is like. And I think experience is fundamental for religious or spiritual sensibilities as well, but there is this tension between the beliefs or concepts that we've been given. It might be an understanding of God, for example, and when those beliefs collide with our experience. And there's a wild thing that happens, right? That could be challenging. People face this collision and they often will say, well, I'm either going to hold on to my image of God, right? Whatever that image is, the one I was given since my youth, or I'm going to let that image evolve as I follow my experience. And so I just think the way of experience is a spiritual path. It's a philosophical path, a scientific path. And I think we're seeing that return. You mentioned Adam Frank, and he, along with Evan Thompson and Marcelo Gleiser, had this beautiful book, The Blind Spot, where he's talking about precisely human experience being this blind spot that we're omitting. That we're part of this world. We feel the world from the inside, and you can't have an adequate worldview ultimately if you disregard the data of human experience. So I'd say that's a larger discussion, but Whitehead is certainly a part of the inspiration of that discussion and wanting to wanting to recover the profound nature of that experience.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to back up a little bit, and
Yeah.
my my podcast is not necessarily about process theology, process philosophy, although I curiously explore it a few times with some folks. So, could you give us a little bit of refresher? What does
Yeah.
process philosophy mean, or process theology? If you're going to
Okay.
explain it to like a middle school student, like what are they,
Sure.
and how might they be different from each other?
Nice. Okay. So for middle school. Good. So most middle schoolers will know, I hope at least, the difference between nouns and verbs. So we can imagine that, let's say there's two fundamental ways of looking at the world. Okay, one would be that the world is a noun-like world. Okay, it's made of noun-like things. And the other would be that it's a verb-like world, right? The world is made fundamentally of verb-like things. So, of course, there's a relationship, as we know when we're learning in middle school, between nouns and verbs. But applied philosophically, there's always been this debate about which is primary and which is secondary, or which is more fundamental and which is derivative. So, to your question, to be a process philosopher is to hold this position that the world is fundamentally a verb like world. It's made of verb like entities. It's becoming, it's happening, it's occurring. It's where this language of process come from. So certainly the noun-like things are real, but for process thinkers, they're an outcome of more fundamental verb-like processes. So
Mm.
in a sentence, process philosophy can be said to be basically a philosophy that sees verbs as fundamental to reality and reality as a verb. So so that's process philosophy. If you want to connect that then to process theology, it would involve including considerations of God in relation to this verb-like nature of reality, insisting, at least in part, that God is not some final and ultimate noun per se, right? But rather the ever-present relational verb, right? That is flowing beneath our existence and our experience. So in a verb-like reality, things are on the move. The future is unsettled and open, and at least process theology affirms that this is the way God relates to the world. God is related in a verb-like relational sense. So process theology deliberately brings the discussion of God in. Not all process philosophers want to do that, but Whitehead certainly brought both of those sides together, this verb-like nature of reality. So what do you think? Do you think a middle schooler would do okay with that, the noun-verb distinction?
I like the noun verb distinction, and it reminded me of something that I heard that I never actually fact checked, but somebody once told me that Eastern cultures learn verbs first and
Mm,
Western cultures learn nouns first. And I'm wondering if that's kind of from our, I guess, our Greek roots of
yeah,
the academy and everything. We want to take everything and make it into a noun that we can then pin into a board and, you know,
sure.
everything's, but the problem with nouns is if they're not verbing, they're dead. It's like,
I love it. I love it.
so yeah,
Absolutely.
it seems like a
It's
very
their verb.
alive
They're
kind of a thing.
yeah, but it would not be that the nouns are verbing. It's that the noun they're verbed into being. Right. I guess that's another
Hmm.
way. The flip side of saying that. Right.
Okay.
Nouns are verbed into being. There's not first a noun that decides to verb, as it were, but
Hmm.
verbing into being is what is happening. Right.
Okay.
So
So
that again, getting that
that there,
fundamental process notion. Sorry.
yeah, we just
Yeah.
we just had on the lectionary we just had John 1, the whole
Okay.
poem
Yeah.
where Jesus is the logos of God and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to totally dive into that, but there's so much
Sure.
verb going on uh, in that whole definition of who God is. That
Yeah.
so I can see how these the process philosophy and process theology are going to play well together when you can kind of step back from the I guess that the Western view of the scriptures that we've all just been immersed in and kind of look
Mm,
at it from a different angle and say, if God is a verb,
hmm.
which Moses with that burning shrub, God says, I am who I will be, or I am who I am becoming, or I will be who I will be. It's really like cryptic,
Great.
but that he's
Yeah.
speaking in verbs, like I am a verb. That's really
But
interesting.
oh, it's such yeah, it's a great point. So, and it's yeah, it's the Exodus passage, but it's interesting. A lot of translations of that passage have it simply "I am that I am," right?
Hmm.
Which could be interpretive. I am simply static, right?
Yeah, that sounds very
I
static
will
with
be
that.
what I am that I am, and I can't be anything more. Um, but I think the translation that is more honoring of the ancient languages is "I will be what I will be," right? And this does designate this kind of movement in the life of God. And you bring up, not that we have to get into the scriptural passages, but even John 1:1, what God became, the Word became flesh. There's that becoming that's
Hmm.
there. This movement, this verb-like movement towards creation. And so I think process thinkers don't want to say, well, God wasn't static and then decided at one point to become towards the world or become flesh. To become is the nature of God, and in part,
Hmm.
the reason the world is the way it is, this becoming, fluid, processive, evolving world, is because its deepest divine reality is that way as well, right? So we want to
Hmm.
think the congruence between our experience of the world as becoming and our concept of God. Why should God be the great exception
Hmm.
to the becoming of reality? Anywho,
Yeah. Do you think that we've made time into a noun when it should be like a verb that's constantly in motion? Like we flatten it out and we make a timeline. Here's the past, here's the future.
Yeah.
God stands outside of time, but time is like this static thing that we exist inside of, like almost like a goo that you can't
Uh,
escape. But
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
comes Einstein, and all of a sudden, like time is relative, and like that's
Uh-huh.
gonna mess with that messes with everything. Like,
Well, definitely. Yeah. I mean, so this is also such a big debate in philosophy, the philosophy of time and in cosmology. And yeah, it was actually Bergson, Andre Bergson, the also he's a modern process philosopher who had a great debate with Einstein precisely on this topic, right? Einstein, he argued, Bergson argued, tended to make time too noun-like. It was discrete, sort of like it was like psychological clock time is all what time was. Whereas Bergson wanted to say, no, no, like it's threaded duration of moments, each bleeding into the other. It's this fluid experiential notion of time. So Whitehead, of course, knew Einstein and had his thoughts about his relativity, but it's certainly the case that it's all utterly connected, and we can no more slice out particular moments of time uh, in any simplistic way than we can say, pause pause our life at any one moment. It's all coming together, and so yeah, time is absolutely fundamental. Time is a verb-like movement, arguably, from the past to the future. And at least for Whitehead, for process thinking, this is important for us, no doubt. It's important metaphysically. It's also important for God. Time is actually internal. So God is not timeless per se, but timeful. And and you can read that scripturally too. It's like we have this image of divine historicity, divine growth, divine movement, a relational God. This is not a God that's standing exterior to time, but one that's involved in it. And I think it makes really all the difference for thinking about the spiritual life as well. This is a God with us, right? To use the
mhm.
Emmanuel language, not outside of us, with us, and that's important, I think, spiritually.
Yeah, there is like when we're talking about being and becoming, which is part one of your series, like that really resonates with my contemplative roots because
Yeah.
like God is actively forming us and actively forming the world, whereas, Christianity outside of its contemplative roots is just a static thing.
Mm.
Now you're saved and don't mess it up, and then one day
Yeah.
you'll get to where you want to go, kind of a thing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I totally agree. So one of the most beautiful statements that Whitehead has made about the religious or spiritual life is, what does he say? It says it's the art and theory of the internal life of man, insofar as it concerns the man himself and what is ultimate in the nature of things. So it's a beautiful statement.
that's
And at
deep.
least from this perspective, what is ultimate is this becoming, right? That we're talking about, this verb like nature. So, as we sort of said already, we're not so much beings that happen to become, we're becoming into being. So, we're being formed and reformed in every moment. I think this is really a liberating thought because we've seen no shortage of, I think, dysfunctional religious or spiritual perspectives that say, well, creation is a one and done event of the past. And you know what? You've already been created, and actually you're corrupted, and you can't become more than you currently are. Whereas I think this perspective says, well, we're always being formed and reformed, right? We can be in awe about the fact that we are, right? This is maybe the being aspect, but what we are can never be divorced from the fact that we're always becoming into being, right? We can be more than we currently are, right? We're creatures of potential, creatures of um, perhaps immaturity, but what we're called to is a deeper sense of maturity about our perspective on the world. So, I mean, if you apply this contemplatively or spiritually, you can sit back in awe and wonder at the fluid nature of reality, right? And this is sort of a more Buddhist orientation. Or you can employ, as the Christian tradition has done, different modes of practice, contemplative prayer, in an effort to discern this divine lure in the process of the world that's, again, calling us to our higher self, calling us to be more than we currently are, more than we currently have been.
Mm.
Um, Now, you mentioned that God is actively forming us, and certainly I agree. But many, I think, religious or spiritual orientations have a tendency to stop there. God is forming us, right? And the relationship is one from God to us, it's unilateral. But for a process type spirituality, it's not just the case, I think, that God is forming us. Okay, we are also forming God. Um,
Whoa,
and so
hey,
Whitehead,
say
that's
more,
this,
say more.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I just said say more on that. We are actively forming God. Like
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
little explosion here.
exactly. Well, Whitehead has this beautiful image of God's um, infinite capacity to grow with the world. In every moment, God is taking in everything that is achieved in the world for triumph or for tragedy, everything that happens, and God is shifting and shaping that reception, then offering back to the world a possibility to be more than it currently is. So
Mm,
it's not just an offering to the. It's not just God forming us. We form God in the sense that what we do, how we live, truly affects the reality of God. It's not that God changes from one state to another. God grows. God relates to the world and incorporates every action of yourself and myself and all your listeners, and is changed in the positive sense of growth and incorporation. And so it's sort of like a philosophical rendering of the deep theme of the New Testament, right? When Jesus says, well, whatever you do unto the world or to the least of these, you also do unto God. And Whitehead didn't quote that, but he's saying yes in a deep way, is that God incorporates um, what we do such that we form God, and that's not just the case that God forms us. And that can be
mhm.
liberating and profound as well. It can give people purpose because your actions extend not simply to those around you, but to the reality of God, for good or ill. It could be a haunting fact as well.
Yeah, okay. Like once you explained it, it's kind of like that really makes sense because God didn't know what it was like to be human until God embodied humanity in Christ. Like,
Mm.
then he knew it from the inside at that point. And like God
Yeah, yeah,
is growing and changing, but then offering. That's so much different than that, like Lord of the Tower medieval, like sometimes steps out of the tower to come and
sure.
bless us, and sometimes just, stays up in the tower and we don't know exactly what's going on up there, but we really
Sure.
hope to get that God's attention. That whole omni God, it stands outside, perfected, static, and everything. And this one
Yeah,
brings God very present, very near, and active, and moving and becoming alongside of us. That's,
yeah.
yeah.
Again, it's a sort of cosmological Emmanuel, right?
Hmm.
But you're right. I mean, traditional philosophical understandings of perfection would say, well, what can you possibly offer God? God is all that God is, has all that God has, and can't be offered anything. And if God can take something from you, well, does that suggest that God changes or is imperfect in the first place? So the process tradition is beautiful because, especially Charles Hartshorne, Whitehead's assistant, argued that there can be a dynamic understanding of perfection, right? Why should perfection mean that God is completely unchanging? Um, shouldn't it mean that God is more changing, the most moved mover rather than an unmoved mover?
Mm.
Um, and there's various debates about that, but I think you're right on. This challenges dominant understandings of God. There's no reason divine perfection should mean God is detached from the world or unable to be affected. It's not that God is becoming less perfect, right? Arguably, a God that can change and surpass God's self in any one moment is more perfect. Arguably, again, there's a lot of sort of literature
Yeah.
on that debate.
I like that dynamic perfection as opposed to
Yeah,
static perfection. I've not ever thought of that because when I think perfect,
yeah,
I think of something that has arrived. And God
sure.
obviously has arrived and is just standing outside of time waiting for everyone else to get their shit together, kind of a thing. But
Right.
really, there's a dynamicness to God's perfection that,
Hmm.
yeah, that's kind of like mind blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's big. It's big. Makes a huge difference in how we conceive um, God.
Hmm.
Because I too want to insist upon divine perfection. Um, I think it's important to do that. But this in no way, you don't have to carry the philosophical baggage that came with ancient Greece, right?
Mm.
Again, we're able and free to rethink the philosophical foundations and how they are embodied in our theological conceptions. I think it's a privilege to do that, and the Christian tradition has been doing that and is still doing it, right? Again, it's
Yeah.
not settled; it's a verb. The Christian tradition is a verb,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit because you mentioned
sure,
theology, you mentioned philosophy, and I've been noticing like my big mistake as a fundamentalist evangelical, my former life, 10 times ago, what like my biggest mistake was making my theology into the metaphysic description of
Okay.
the world. So I had a very Frank Peretti understanding of the world. Like you peel back the layer, you're going to see spiritual forces. Somehow, for some weird reason, they're all stuck in the Bronze Age. Like the
Right.
angels have, like armor and swords and everything. And I'm like, well, that was high tech when they wrote it, but now they're just stuck there for some reason. So I,
Sure.
I created like a metaphysic out of my theology
Mm-hmm.
that was dated, that was old, that was very medieval. And now I'm noticing, like, if I separate my theology from my metaphysic, I can talk theologically without assuming that this is the description of ultimate reality that everyone has to sign on to. So I've really been trying to
Great.
separate out metaphysic and theology. You want to talk a little bit about maybe some things
Sure.
about that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, it's such a great point. So to do so, yeah, I'm remembering a great statement that Whitehead makes in his book Religion in the Making. It's slim, but it's powerful. And he says there that Christianity has always been a religion looking for a metaphysics.
Mm,
And it's great because he said, Christian faith is founded, or theological perspectives. Obviously, I had the same background you did, the fundamentalist evangelical world, at least for a time. But you have the historical data that is productive of the faith, right? There's certain history associated with it, arguably. But that history doesn't tell you how the world works in its most intimate foundational dimensions, right?
right.
And that's what metaphysics is about. Metaphysics is about a system of ideas that will give you insight into the deepest level of reality. And so you can hold your theological convictions while being unconscious of the metaphysics, right? They're different, but of course they're related. I would recommend that we hold our theological perspective um, acknowledging or at least being open to what sort of metaphysics could be. So you mentioned sort of this, well, dogmatic element, right? We don't really realize how we've transferred our theology into this metaphysical statue, if you want. So I just think I think theology and metaphysics have to honor the profound mystery of things, you know?
Mm,
And I think often when you talk to seasoned theologians or pastors, at least some that I know, you can get this sense that, that there's no mystery in their eyes. It's
mm-hmm.
like that,
Yeah.
like everything that's been said has been said, and we just need to believe it, right? And there could be lack of wonder, not exclusively, but you kind of get that sense. But nothing really could be further from the truth. We have to keep the sense of mystery alive in theology, and we have to do it in metaphysics. In fact, it just is alive. Even if we say it's not, the fact of mystery, a deep mystery, is alive. So to speak of Whitehead again, he was one of the most harsh critics of dogmatism, I think, in the history of philosophy. And not just philosophical dogmatism, right? But scientific dogmatism, religious dogmatism. He has this great statement where he says, in philosophic discussion, the merest hint of dogmatic finality, no, he says, the merest hint of dogmatic certainty as to finality of statement is an exhibition of folly.
Wow.
Right? So it's like such a beautiful way of expressing that. So I just think that process philosophy wants to first and foremost honor the profound mystery of God. It wants to honor the profound mystery of the world, but it does so in a way that doesn't distance ourselves from the mystery. So it finds this mystery, we might say, welling up from within us. So the metaphysical endeavor is not about lofty thoughts on an armchair, that are detached from our experience. Metaphysics, as Whitehead conceives it, really is all about experience. It's about the development of this tentative system of ideas that is adequate to the whole range of human experience. And included in that is theological, spiritual, religious experience, which for him should not be left out. We have to include that. So I guess the theme of what I'm saying is we have to honor mystery, and the mystery is within us. We have to do our best by seeking truth in all of our disciplines to try to grasp that mystery and be conscious of the metaphysics or the philosophy we're bringing to it, because often in science, in religion, that metaphysics is often unconscious. So I think we have to
Mm-hmm.
shed light on that.
Yeah. And the science has their own metaphysic as well that is like stripped of mystery because everything you can just, reductionism says you just boil it all the way down to the atoms that make up, and the quarks and everything. and we're
Yeah.
just the sum of our parts kind of a thing. There's a reductionism that has no mystery to it there as well.
Well, you remind me of a statement Whitehead makes. He says scientists often say they dislike metaphysics, but what they really mean is they dislike their metaphysics being questioned. you know, so there's always this hibernating background. It's like the white noise of metaphysics that's always there, um,
Hmm.
and we're trying to turn the volume up in Whitehead's universe. It's like, let's make these assumptions, this perspective, conscious. Let's turn the volume up and see what it
Yeah,
does to our worldview.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that it's time to, science has given us great things. I'm a nerd when it comes to astronomy and cosmology,
me
and
too.
even physics and quantum physics. I can just nerd out on all this stuff and have a lot of fun. But I always have it in service to the mystery because I'm
Yeah,
curious at nature. I'm trying to learn more things, and then theologically, now I'm trying to bring those theological conversations that I've had and been trained in and have that also in service to the mystery so that I'm not
yeah,
just arriving at these conclusions and now, thus saith the Lord or thus saith the science kind of a thing. But
yeah.
everything is in service to this mystery that we really don't know what's on the other side. When we breathe our last breath, we have no idea what is over there. But
Sure.
there's beautiful poetic language that teaches us about it. And then there's scientific stuff that can teach us about it. And I'm
hmm
just really
hmm
curious about both of those ends of the spectrum.
Well, you're a philosopher, Tom.
I think so.
Clearly. No, I'm totally with you. I think of Karl Rahner, you know, the Roman Catholic 20th century brilliant theologian who spoke of God as the holy mystery. And I really like that language too,
Mm,
because you can have a mystery that's sort of vacuous and you just don't know. A mystery can even be frightening, right?
mm-hmm,
But a holy mystery is like this compelling, luring. There's something about it that you can't quite. It has a magnetism to it.
mm,
And I think so. I think the posture you're describing is basically a spiritual posture. It's one of openness and wonder, honoring the mystery, and doing our best. In
mm.
the end, that's all we can ask for, and all we can do our best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you quoted Whitehead in, like, you gave me a kind of a printout of where you
Uh
were
huh.
going with the course. And one of the quotes from Whitehead really got me. You said, "We are in the present. The present is always shifting. It is derived from the past. It is shaping the future. It is passing into the future. This is process, and in the universe, it is an inexorable fact." That really resonates with
Nice.
my contemplative roots as well, because we have that whole sacrament of the present moment kind of a thing
Ah.
where we seem to be everywhere but the present. Like I said something dumb in my sermon on Sunday and I'm like obsessing about it. So I'm not here, I'm there. Or,
Nice.
I have this conversation planned, in a week and I'm not here, I'm there. And the
Hmm.
contemplative tradition tells us to recollect our scattered existence across space, time, and geography into the present moment. And it's a
Beautiful.
practice of recollection. You recollect your scattered this existence into this present moment. How does your understanding of like time and process and God kind of shape our experience of the present? God, the
Mm.
world, and our role within it. How do you see that?
Yeah, yeah, that is a great question. Well, let me pick up on the sacramental bit first, I think, because
Okay.
so process philosophy and theology really is, I would say, a sacramental orientation towards life. And of course,
I like that.
the yeah, the traditional understanding of a sacrament, right, is something under, in, and through which the reality of God is made known. In fact, you'll see that I've been emptying my bookshelves behind me. I just put away this morning a really beautiful book by Leonardo Boff, who is a liberation theologian. It's a very slim book, but it's titled "Sacraments of Life:
Mm,
Life of Sacraments," and it's all about how the most mundane objects of our lives, your grandfather's cigarette butt or a coffee mug, can be just transparent sacraments of the holy mystery. Right? It's a beautiful book. Just as an aside, it was on my desk this morning. So yeah, a sacramental vision. But you are right, with respect to time, right? And we're so, especially recently, we're so preoccupied. We're everywhere but the present, right? We might be consumed with the settled past, what has been, right, or worrying about the unsettled future, what still may be. But what connects them, right? What connects them is this present moment that I think cannot really be escaped, right? And of course, I think the present moment is like this connecting bridge between the past and the movements of the past and the future, and it's this element of temporality, this element of time. So I think Whitehead's thinking, my thinking, time is fundamental. It's a movement from the past, the present, to the future, but you can never quite grab it, right? As soon as you grab a single moment, it moves on.
Hmm.
But there is, I think, a spiritual place to say that this moment that we're in is an ultimate moment, right? And meditative practices, as you were sort of suggesting, do call us back to this ultimate moment between the past and the future as all that we have. So I'd say that time, our experience of time matters in process philosophy and theology. It's not illusory, as some perspectives want to say, the illusion of time in some sort of static universe. Rather, I would say it's more accurate to say that time is a revelation of this universe. It's another way of speaking of ultimate becoming. It's arguably, for process theology, a revelation of God, right? God relates to time intimately, such that it's internal, I'd say, to God, rather than external. God, again, is not solely timeless, but
Hmm.
time full. And, well, as Blake said, eternity is in love with the productions of time, right? I think that's a beautiful, beautiful expression of the process God, who is eternal in nature, but ever related to time in becoming. And yeah, I just think that's a different spiritual orientation, right? Eternity in love with time.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
I'm
anyhow,
reminded of my favorite Irish philosopher, John O'Donohue, where
mm,
he talks about time being a product of eternity, where the present moment flows from eternity, and then, he asks the question, well, where did time go? And he says it just flows back into eternity. So every moment is an
yeah,
experience of eternity because time is constantly flowing from and returning to the eternal, whatever that might mean, which
sure.
I think is pretty profound thought about time itself.
Most definitely. I mean, time constitutes a deep and abiding mystery. And it's too easy theologically to say that, well, God is just beyond all time, right? Yes, in a sense. But what about the deep intuitions of presence in time? You know, So, divine omniscience, as classically understood, was this perspective that God sees the past, present, the future as an eternal now, right? There's no
Hmm.
surprise for God.
Hmm.
As Raymond Panikkar, the great Spanish philosopher priest, said, a fully omniscient God in this sense can't laugh, right? There's no surprise.
Hmm. Wow.
So
That is deep. That is really
it,
deep.
it is. I know we want a God that laughs, right? After all, there's much we find funny. But I think it is so important because for Whitehead, for process theologians and philosophers, God knows all that can be known, right? And that's all that can be asked for of omniscience. But all that can be known is not the future as actual, right? The future, by definition, logically speaking, is possible and non-actual, and God knows it as a range of possibilities. So it's not a hit against God's omniscience to say that, well, God doesn't know, what you're going to eat next year for breakfast. Um, right? God knows the range of possibilities. And again, this is back to this Emmanuel theme where God is with the universe in the travails of time. God and the universe are adventuring together. And, your life is not planned for you. God provides the conditions of possibility so you can be and become, but God does God's best to guide you into certain avenues of flourishing. But those are not, your life is not set from the very beginning. God is not controlling or knowing everything you are and can do. You can surprise God. You can even make God laugh. So
I
I like to
really,
think I make God laugh every once in a while.
both in good and bad ways, in my experience, probably.
Definitely.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Like, like our concept of science has just exploded over the last 100 years. Can we open up? Einstein reshaped our understanding of time and light and gravity. The Hubble expanded our concept of the size of the universe. Darwin
Mm,
expanded our understanding of the history of life on Earth and how it came to be. Niels Bohr expanded like our understanding of how physics works down at the quantum level, which we had no idea about all that. And here the
Mm.
church still sits with this medieval cosmology that's still human centric, earth centric, patriarchal, colonial. How
Yeah.
might Whitehead contribute to expanding our cosmologies with his work, and what might that look like?
Yeah. Well, really well put, well phrased for sure, and
I
very
had to
important
read it
question.
because I didn't want to
Yeah.
mess that one up. It was right there.
No. There's a great the different figures you mentioned. Absolutely. So, um, yeah, the church. Okay, so here's where I think the concept of becoming can be applied ecclesiologically, right? And this is important.
Okay.
So we might say that where the world is unfinished, right, or where knowledge, say, of the world is unfinished, the church also is unfinished in its knowledge. Of course, the church has its faith, its commitment, but the church is not in the business of, you know, telling us scientifically how the world works, right? And that distinction, I think, is very important. So the church, in this regard, I think, has to and continues to evolve. And historically, we definitely see that. So by and large, I think the church has been able to evolve through these different sort of revolutions that you've been mentioning. So it was said that the Copernican revolution, right, would destroy the church and destroy religion. Of course, it didn't, right? Most churches would say, you know, of course, actually, an early, you know, theologians at the time agreed with Copernicus, and saying that we live in a heliocentric rather than a geocentric universe. Okay, arguably the same with the Darwinian revolution, right? Certainly, it challenged certain long-standing assumptions, but it certainly didn't destroy religion, right? Most intelligentsia of the church accept evolution as completely true, as a reality. But the quantum revolution is an interesting one, right? So here's one where it's not so obvious that these findings of the fluid, wild, pulsating, energetic nature of the world would somehow be a challenge to religion. I think, to the contrary, a lot of spiritual religious sensibilities have seen the quantum world as aiding their commitment, or at least supporting, I think, certain understandings where consciousness or mind or spirit or energy or life is more fundamental. So, so this is an example of how paying attention really to the revolutions of science can challenge at times, but by and large insist the further evolution and the growth of the church. The church is always committed to the notion that all truth is God's truth. And if that's the case, we cannot disregard what we find to be settled truths of science. There's a lot of truths that are not so settled, right? There's theories and whatnot. We can be involved in those debates. But the point I'm making is just that life is an adventure, and the church needs to embody this adventure. The church, to hark back to our previous comment, has to have mystery behind its eyes too. It's the mystery of creation. It's the mystery of God. We do not have it all settled, and science is or can be a religious and devotional act. And I think the church's orientation towards science should try to embody that devotion uh, and that mystery. So, does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I really like how you talked about embodiment, which
Yeah.
is really weird to me now that I have a perspective that I do, how much trouble the church has with embodiment when it's the core
Yeah.
tenet of our faith that said that God,
Became
infleshed
flesh. Yeah.
himself into
Right.
creation and put on a body. And then
Uh-huh.
we want to instead of make the word flesh, we want to make the flesh into an idea or a
Hmm.
concept or a theology, and then keep everything all inside of our brains. And
Yeah.
I think we're now really with like new understandings of psychology and trauma and how things are stored in the body and how the nervous system works. We're really starting to understand like the holiness of embodiment a little bit
Yeah.
better. And I'm hoping the church keeps going on that direction because I do think it's a
Sure.
core tenet of the faith, that incarnation piece.
Well, yeah, and you're reminding me of the debate, in church history was whether or not we can image, you know, God, image the person of Christ. And it's like there was this debate. Well, we can't image God because God can't be imaged. And to do so would be idolatry, and you don't want that. Right? That's a bad thing. And yet others said, well, God has been imaged in the person of Christ. God took on flesh in Christ. So yes, we can, right? God has imaged God's self.
Hmm.
So yes, we can sculpt, draw pictures of God, as long as we know we're approximating that image.
Mm-hmm.
So, the word became flesh is one of the most challenging and bewildering and beautiful statements. The Word did not become pages in a book, right? So the Word there is not the Bible. You hear this all the time. The Word became a person. The Word became um, flesh in the person of Christ. And so I just think that grants us so many interesting avenues for, as you say, thinking about embodiment. And actually, the literature on that right now really is exploding. Um, so yeah, there's a lot to be said there, but certainly it's important, most
Mm,
definitely.
yeah, and I think that can really expand our cosmology, because one of the problems with, I think, the church is keeping the small cosmology, because that's something we can understand and have control over and teach and be assured of and confident in, and then
Sure.
the explosion of all of these fields of science and psychology and cosmology. I think
Yeah.
it left the church feeling a little bit powerless. Like, hey, we used to be the ones in charge dispensing all the truths, and now look at all this stuff, and we're on the outside.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, it's a humbling.
Yeah. It really is. And again, church, I think, and they've struggled with this, right? But there are a lot of good representatives who are doing good work too, internal to the church, and promoting the magnitude and the beauty of an unfolding evolutionary cosmos, and how this really assists us in the spiritual walk rather than disists, right? We it can help. And again, it's not that science is guiding the ship, but science is in the business of revealing truths that are relevant to theological and religious conceptions, and it would be silly of us to dismiss those, you
Mm.
know.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think Whitehead's understanding of God is? You kind
Oh.
of give him the name, the chief exemplification of the universe. What does that mean, as
Ah,
if
got it.
as a description of God?
Yeah. All right. Well, so first and foremost, I'd say Whitehead. One way to express it. Again, it gets technical in the course. We're going to be getting into this in part four, especially, which is God as poet of the world. But Whitehead views God as the foundation of being, we could say, and the fountain of becoming. Right.
Mm,
And again, as you say, one of the most important claims he makes, one of the most famous claims, is that God is not an exception, say, to the pulsating depths of reality, but their chief exemplification. And so, why is this important? Well, because there's been a debate um, about how God relates to metaphysics, to the very depths of reality. And largely, there's two options. So one could say that God is a complete exception to them, right? In this sense, God would stand exterior to the world, to you, um, to metaphysics. Like God creates the metaphysical world and stands outside of it in a sort of a supernatural way. Or, and this is Whitehead's opinion, God chiefly embodies the ultimate metaphysical principles of reality and is naturally related to the world from the inside, right? So we could see this as sort of a natural, supernatural kind of distinction. So the metaphysical depths of reality are embodied in God rather than created, by God in some omnipotent boom. God, these principles live through the life of God, and what creation is the sharing of these metaphysical depths with the world. So, and this implicates how we think about divine action because it's not from the outside in, breaking the world's normal regularities. It's more of a welling up from within, right? It's from the bottom rather than the top.
mm,
And so we don't need to go into it now, but you know, Whitehead speaks of the primordial nature as God as the ground, the primordial nature of God as the ground of possibility, like the ground of the future. It's the beginning of every single event. But God is also the consequent nature, which is this ground of the past, the storehouse of truth and meaning. It's the end of every event. So he even uses the language familiar to Scripture that God is the Alpha and the Omega. God's the Alpha and Omega of every single event. But in these roles, God is not beyond external, um, uh, supernaturally outside the world. God is in every way intimately tangled with it. God is ultra natural, we might say, as opposed to supernatural. If that
mm.
helps.
Yeah, that was my next question, was what do we do with
Oh yeah.
supernaturalism? Because
Okay.
we kind of have a supernatural, there's a natural and then there's a supernatural, whereas
Mm.
God is not a material thing inside the universe, therefore it cannot be detected or we can't find God, have evidence of God, point to that and say, there, we found God. So because God
Mm-hmm.
is not a material being inside of the world, but a supernatural being outside of the world. So what
Mm-hmm.
is this
Mm-hmm.
ultra materialism that you're talking about, and how would that
Yeah,
interact with our reality?
yeah. Well, not ultra materialism, but ultra naturalism, right? So, I mean, that might be one way to frame it. So, it's certainly the case that supernaturalism is in retreat, right?
Hmm.
Um, but that doesn't mean the world is suddenly disenchanted, right? So, it wasn't God's idea to be supernatural; it's our idea that God must be that, right? So, I think to speak of God as ultra natural is sort of a challenging inversion of that. But you don't lose God, arguably, in the process. So, I think to the extent that supernaturalism has meant that God controls the world from the outside, or interrupts the world, or disregards the world, then certainly it's inadequate. And a lot of the squabbles in the science religion debate have surrounded you know the meaning of supernaturalism. So our science, arguably presupposes the integrity, the continuity of nature and its regularities, and supernaturalism is a threat to that if it imagines God from the outside breaking those regularities and acting occasionally from within them, right?
Hmm.
But again, that's not the full story. I think an ultra naturalism is put forth by a number of great thinkers like Ian Barber, Tom Ord, certainly David Griffin, Phil Clayton, who else? John Polkinghorne, all of whom hold um, robustly to the reality of God, but do not do so in terms of supernaturalistic conception, right? So I just think there's a naturalistic understanding of God that doesn't lose God, but actually rediscovers God in the processes of the world, rather than outside of them. And I think that is a way to make this distinction between, supernaturalism and ultranaturalism, for
Mm.
example. But of course, I
Okay.
mean that's a very long discussion,
It
but a
is.
very important one.
Yeah. I have Chad Ball coming on the show because he wrote his
Yeah,
doctoral thesis on that
good.
whole end of
Yep,
supernaturalism kind of a thing. So we're going to have a deep conversation on that sometime in March, I think.
that'll be
Um,
good. I'm reading his dissertation right now, and I'm on his committee, so I'll be
oh,
you know
nice. Okay.
be dialoguing with him in the future here too. So
Oh, very good. That makes
he's
me
doing good
happy.
work.
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
So that whole supernaturalism piece is really interesting to me. I'm being metaphysically curious about the nature of reality. I can get into like paranormal podcasts sometimes. It's like my guilty
Sure.
pleasure. And
Hmm.
what I really like is when they involve science. Like, let's use this EVP recorder to try and pick up the ghost's voice, or let's use these
Yeah.
thermal cameras to pick up temperature. And there's something about that says that the supernatural realm does have an influence on the natural realm that is picked up by
Hmm.
scientific instruments. But
Yeah.
we've never seen that applied to God at all, or spirituality, or angels, or demons, or whatever spiritual beings in the supernatural sense. Do you have any thoughts around how God might show up in the physical world?
Yeah. So I mean, first year, my fiance and I over the New Year started watching X Files again just for fun.
Oh, I love
For,
that show. It's
you
so
know,
good.
from the very beginning, the first season is all very corny and funny. They're super young.
Oh
It's going to
yeah.
get better, but yeah, no, I'm with you being very interested in that topic, especially the UAP UFO discussion,
Oh yeah.
which now is getting treated philosophically in a lot of different interesting ways. So,
Yep. Same here.
um, but yeah, God is not the type of reality that you would submit to scientific analysis, right? It's not as if you're gonna. It's like the old adage of some Russian astronaut who went to space and didn't see God and therefore concluded God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So there's a deep truism that says God is not a being that's somewhere out there that may or may not exist, right? You're
Hmm.
not going to find God with a telescope or a microscope, right? Um, the question of God is about the ground of all being, right? Which is inevitably presupposed, even if we deny it verbally. There's something that allows the possibility and indeed the actuality of existence. We don't know what that something is. Science has its ideas, right? The quantum vacuum, okay, whatever the hell that is,
Hmm.
right? It's a lot of interesting stuff. So there's something that allows the existence of the world ontologically. Now, throughout the religious and spiritual tradition, there's been the conviction that we can discern something of this experience internal to us, right? But it's also hidden in a certain way, right? So there's a whole debate about the hiddenness of God, etc. But I just think that we have to be careful about, the criterion we have for saying God is or is not active. It's not like any one scientific experiment is going to get you there. You have to take the whole world at once, right? Cosmology, the fact that the world seems to be fine-tuned for creatures of ourselves who value and who worry about possibility and who are concerned stubbornly with meaning and purpose. What kind of universe is that, right? What grounds the possibilities of being in the first place? Science doesn't answer that question. It presupposes it. What grounds the values that science is after? Science doesn't create those things, right? It assumes it in the pursuit of truth. So there's a deeper metaphysical well, and to use your words, we have to keep our metaphysical curiosity going. The claim that process philosophers and theologians are making, the claim that Whitehead makes, is that God is the very center of every event, right? God is what gives birth to your next event of experience, right? The ground of the possible, so you can become something and not nothing, right? So let me bring in the poet of the world language, because that's, again, part 4 of the book. The larger statement says, God does not create the world, rather God saves it. Or, more accurately, God is the poet of the world with tender patience, leading it by the divine vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. Right? It's such a beautiful statement because it's God's meeting the world on terms of value. God doesn't create a world in the sense that it's an omnipotent boom. Nor does God do that for you. Right? At least in Whitehead's vision, God gives the conditions of possibility to you so that you can create yourself. And God's role is salvation in the sense that God keeps actuality alive, right? So that it doesn't dissolve into nothing. God is offering the next possibility so that actuality can live and not die, right? And it's in this sense that God is saving the world from moment to moment. It's sort of we hear of continuous creation, creatio continua, but at least in Whitehead's universe, it's also continuous salvation, right? Creatio salus, we might say, right? God is saving the world from moment to moment so it can live on to be more rather than less, so it can live and rather than die. And we just, to bring us full circle, have to come back to this contemplative, the spiritual sitting with the fact of our existence. We have to attune ourselves to our experience. That is where the reality of God will be found, not in some microscope or telescope, although I encourage us to keep looking through those as well, because who knows what we'll find.
Gosh. Well, I think that's a perfect way to just put a bow on this conversation. That was a great thought. Where do you want to send folks to sign up for your online course and to buy some of your books that you've been writing?
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, Tom. Yeah, go to whiteheadsuniverse.com, everybody, where you can learn more about the course there. You can download the syllabus and then sign up for a section that is going to be relevant to your time zone. So you can register now for the January and February iteration of the course, which is filling up, and the March-April iteration will open up in early February. And you can follow my work at andrewmdavis.info. You can subscribe there. I've got a lot of great new work coming out in this new year, as well as subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I try to keep updated on different talks and lectures and link to discussions like I'm having with my friend Tom here. So that's the best way to follow up with me.
Awesome. Well, I will put those links in the comments so people can just click on them and head right there real easy.
Fantastic. Tom, thanks Andrew, very much.
Thank you so much. This has been a fun conversation, and I hope to have you on again when you release that book. We'll talk about it.
I'll definitely keep you posted. It's a little bit of ways to go, but it's on the way. It's becoming, we'll say.
It's process.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.